so all of us work for the Royal Horticultural Society. We are UK's largest gardening charity, and they're on the advisory side of things, but we collaborate very closely. And I'm on the science side of the RHS. We are a relatively small but growing team at the moment, just under 100 people, and doing applied horticultural science in all its aspects. So my research is on green infrastructure quite widely. I'm a plant physiologist by training. And my interests are in understanding how what we as physiologists and biologists know about plant function, how could that be put to use, and particularly in my case in urban context, to solve some environmental issues. So I'm interested how different plants, be it as growing on green roofs or on walls or as trees or hedges, as it may be in this case that I'm presenting here, how do those different plants act to regulate temperatures, to trap pollution, to capture excess rainfall, to regulate noise. So those are my 4 current interests. Obviously, green infrastructure and various plants within it do a lot more things, but that's where over the last 15 years or so I've been working. And then probably for the best part of the last 7 years, I've used Hedges as a model to study those 4 services. And this general umbrella term, I would say, that I put my research under is around these 4 top bullet points that I've slided here. So I'm trying to figure out to what extent this fact that plants provide different plants basically provide different benefits, but they provide them simultaneously. And as scientists, we tend to study usually these individual services or benefits in isolation. So when I first started my research, I was really interested in how plants regulate temperature. But then, of course, the same plant will probably be capturing pollution and doing something for biodiversity and doing something for noise. So it's then how do you put all these various services together and how do you rank different planting? Then also, I think of late, I've become a lot more interested in the scale of impact because, biologically, when you look at plant A as opposed to plant Z, providing they're sufficiently different in their function and structure, of course, they will be providing those different benefits to different extents. But at which point do you lose, the scale takes over? On a leaf level, you can almost always detect some difference, providing your tools sufficiently widely. But do you then see the impact on a garden scale, on a street scale, on a city scale, if you want to influence the environment? And then also, how do you look after those plants? How do you manage them? Can drastically really alter the effect of benefits. You can almost negate some of the benefits. So this slide is quite packed with information, but it is a summary of quite a long period of research of quite a few people, myself and several of my PhD students and collaborators, where we have tried to identify what were the underpinning traits which can be linked with good provision of certain services. And we've looked at, what do plants need to cool well, what do plants need to capture rainfall well, what do they need to trap pollution well, in terms of how they function and how they look like, how they're structured rather than ornamentally how they look, are they appealing or not. So Madalena Vaz-Monteiro, she looked at green roofs as model and various plants. We looked at the importance of color and leaf thickness and leaf transpiration rate. So that's the speed at which plants use and lose water. And she found that these were the identifying traits which were linked to better provision of cooling services. So plants which have high transpiration rates, that are quite thirsty, use a lot of water, they cool well. I mean, I could give you a whole lecture as to why and how and what are the mechanisms. Light leaf color, presence of hairs were the traits which were associated with good cooling at leaf level and plant level. And then obviously the bigger the plant, the better. And you can see that there is quite an overlap in terms of traits that are seen can be seen as favorable to provide a number of services because the mechanisms underpinning them are complementary. So Again, for rainfall capture, these are the traits that you need: high transpiration rate, large plants, presence of hairs. For pollution trapping, again, presence of hair, large plants. So you see the repeating theme there a little bit. So that was done on all sorts of, that was a research that we've done on trees and on green roof species, green walls as well. But then 2016, I have moved to using hedges as a model because I wanted to begin to put some sort of equation together, equation in a figurative sense of how do you add up various services that different plants can do, and what do they do better and what do they do less well. And hedges seemed like a useful green infrastructure type. Because in British urban landscapes, they are quite prevalent. A lot of gardeners, domestic gardens in the UK have them. I mean, nearly 90% of people in UK are homeowners, and many of them have their domestic green spaces, and many of them still use hedges, not hedgerows in a sense that Nigel was mentioning, but small plots of like a boundary between the private green spaces. They're also quite present in our landscape as roadside divides around parks and schools and so on. So they're widely used. They are linear, which is also advantageous in some aspects, which I can't get into at the moment. But in terms of air quality, that's a trait which is useful. They're also relatively cheap, especially if you're getting bare root ones, and they're relatively space saving. So in urban realm, there's a lot of a pull between what do you use your space for, and you usually want to use it for humans and for buildings, and then interjecting green infrastructure, which is relatively cheap and also doesn't take up much space but can be efficient, is beneficial. And I wanted to begin to put together into this, as I say, figurative equation, the role that different types of plants carrying different traits can contribute in terms of temperature regulation, rainfall runoff, air quality improvement, and noise reduction. It's just because obviously you could be adding other things, and I will be collaborating with colleagues on other topics, but this is where I've either found complementary expertise from collaborators or where my own expertise lies. So please don't get scared from this huge amount of text here. It's intended more to, as an aid memoir after the lecture, or if you're screenshotting. So when we first started this research, of course, the inevitable thing that a scientist does, they look at the literature and see what's out there already. So we have published a paper in 2019, and the link is in this bottom link. It's an open access, free to access paper, and it's summarized in this RHS web page as well. So we've looked at what's known in the literature about 45 species that were either currently very popular in we called it temperate climate. So we've looked at British catalogs, French, German, Dutch, and Belgium in terms of what's being sold, what's being used. Also, I spoke to my contacts in the nursery industry. So we've identified about 45 species that are either very widely used or were predicted to become quite popular as the climate changes. And then we've looked at what's available in the literature about them in terms of what's known about how well they capture particulate pollution, so the dust in the air, how well they can reduce noise, how well they attenuate rainfall and reduce flood risks, what's known about their contribution to wildlife. And from the literature, we have identified what are the characteristics, theoretical characteristics, which are associated with good provision of particular services. So if you wanted, a hedge that predominantly reduces noise, then these are the characteristics you need in it: wide, tall, multi-stratified belts of evergreen species and dense canopies. And then these are the representatives that could form, that could be managed or already inherently have some of the characteristics which would lend themselves to good noise reduction. So the list on the right is not exhaustive. It is just what is found in the literature, but it doesn't mean that other species that have these characteristics or varieties, other taxa, that they couldn't do the service well. And so, as I say, it's all summarized in this RHS webpage. If you need it for practical guidance, it should be there, or it is there. Obviously, being as a scientist, you try and balance your argument. We clearly looked very heavily at the positives, but we also looked at what are potential disservices associated with the choice of particular species, what's already known. And then there were a few taxa that cropped up as potentially allergenic, that are used as hedges, some that can be invasive, that we need to be mindful of when using. It doesn't mean that it's, we should completely never use them if they're not on red listed, but it's more the question of a context where we use them. And also, bear in mind that this was the review is aimed at urban hedges, and therefore some of these choices may not be suitable for rural areas because of the spread, perhaps, and sort of invasiveness risk. But in the city context, they may be okay. And then also we considered the management, even though it's not strictly, a ecological disservice, but we felt that intensive management of subspecies also we need to be aware of that, because it can really alter the benefit and also the sustainability of the whole installation, as it were. So here I'm going to just focus on two experiments that we have done more recently, which focus around air quality. And I am conscious that obviously in a historical gardens context, air quality perhaps is less of an issue, or using your hedges, you use them for different reasons. It's, for maybe some spatial function or visual appearance function, whereas here it's more of an environmental function. But there is a lot of talk about hedges as barriers and their role in air quality. And I thought, well, maybe for your sort of general CPD, as it were, this sort of information, may be useful in some form. So these are the experiments that we have done a few years back. It was largely a project by a master's student, Zinat Kadir, in just before pandemic, where we have looked at hedges of Crataegus, Thuja, and Cotoneaster, which we have planted quite mature plants a year before the project started in central Reading. So as you can see here, this is light blue is the location of the tree species that we planted in a replicated manner. We had strips of tree species replicated 3 times. And this was our high traffic location. It's by a roadside that has a traffic intensity of about, I think, over 40,000 cars per day. And then we've also, we've looked at a period of time when there was no rainfall, and we've collected leaves after they've been exposed to roadside traffic pollution for a period of dry weather. And then just took some leaf samples and she washed them and filtered them, and we looked at the weight of particulate matter of dust that was collecting on those leaves. And our assumption was that if there was more on the leaves, there was less in the air, so that higher concentration of pollution on the leaves was an indicator of a hedge providing a better capture, better air quality improvement service. So what we have found is we've looked at 3 species, as I said, Cotoneaster franchetii, because of its hairy leaves, looked at native hawthorn, Crataegus monogyna, and we looked at Thuja plicata, western red cedar, and we collected samples from the front and the back of the hedge. And basically in our heavy traffic location by this sort of 6-lane motorway in central Reading, we found that there were species differences. So the hairy-leaved Cotoneaster provide better sequestration, as you would expect. I mean, other literature also suggests that these leaves, which have complex structures, such as Cotoneaster and Thuja, are better than smooth leaves. But we also, the way that we've interpreted the finding, because we looked at the front and the back, the fact that, we had very little difference in the front and the back sampling between the less efficient species, we interpreted as, well, they need to be deeper in order to provide that service. Whereas when you have a more efficient species, in inverted commas, like Cotoneasta, you can have a slightly narrower hedge strip and still achieve reduction in pollution concentration if you're using it as a barrier. But what we have also found in sampling from locations which were less, which had less traffic. So there was a location just outside of center with a traffic intensity of about 6,000 cars per day. And then also the campus of the University of Reading, where actually I'm based, my post is at the university, where there's no traffic at all. It's in the center of the campus that's very, very green. We found that, again, yes, there were some species differences, but when the traffic intensity is lower, or there is no traffic intensity, then clearly the impact of, in the location where we have measured, impact of species was less important. So this, fixation on species choice and what is your most efficient performer clearly is less important in situations where you don't have high background pollution level. It's possibly quite important in the situations where you are in a city center and you're really needing to solve that air quality issue, then yes. But otherwise, any green barrier would most likely do. So here, from this, I'm going to move into something even I suppose less applicable, but more as a teaser to give you an idea where people in other areas are also looking and thinking. So staying with the air quality team, I have a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Warwick through a PhD project by Letizia Pondini that RHS is co-funding. And Letizia is also looking at different hedge species and how they capture particulate pollution, but she is particularly interested how that then links with composition and abundance of leaf bacteria. And the reason why she's interested in leaf bacteria, if you've never thought about it, is because some of these leaf bacteria actually can themselves break down some of the ambient pollution. So some of those leaf bacteria are actually quite positive agents in improving the air quality. And we wanted to see what is the interaction between air pollution and these leaf bacteria. And then is it the same for any species that you're growing as a hedge, or does it change depending on what type of plant you're actually growing? And so she was testing this in 3 situations, campus of the University of Warwick, which actually ended up being quite, the air quality wasn't brilliant there. And then even worse than the roadside that she was sampling from. And then obviously there's a lot less pollution in the woodland, quite removed from the main road. And she found that depending on the location, composition of bacterial communities was quite distinct. So she had very different bacteria, or not very, but sufficiently different bacteria in her campus, the polluted location, as opposed to the woodland location, as opposed to kind of intermediate. It was very closely linked to the level of particulate matter on the leaves. And then we also found that the bacterial abundance, so how much bacteria we had on those leaves, was also correlated with the level of particulate matter that we had on the leaves. So that where we had less pollution, we had, as you can see, so this is the level of, the gray bar is the level of pollution, and yellow bar is abundance of bacteria. So the more polluted it is, the less bacteria you have. And so this is something that, Letizia is now following up, and we're trying to unpick which bacteria are being affected, what function those bacteria do have, and how it correlates with the type of leaf surface that they are, because we are seeing some differences between species that have smooth leaves as opposed to species that have rougher and sort of more leaves with ridges and so on. So I think this is really just a bit of a teaser as to what's happening in the science that unpicks the plant function and tries to put it into practice. I hope that at least that big, very wordy slide, which gives you ideas of the species and the services that they provide, could be useful for your working context. And on this note, I'm just going to, last two slides not introduce, but mention some other things I'm working on at the moment. I currently have a project funded by Royal Commission, which is looking at the application of hedgerows in the school context, so as cheap barriers in school playgrounds. And I've just started some work with children in one school near Weasley Garden, which is looking to engage children with the science of studying ecosystem services using hedges as a model, and then seeing how that interaction or whether it changes their perception of what nature-based solutions can do to improve the environment. And yes, on this note, I just wanted to, sign out, as it were, with thanks to my many hardworking, bright PhD students and collaborators at universities of Reading, Warwick, and also colleagues in the RHS. So I'll stop sharing and happy to take questions, and please get in touch if you are interested in any detail.